And record to the cloud. Great. All right. Welcome, everyone. I am delighted to have you here with us tonight. My name is Betsy More, and I am Director of Programs at the Jewish Women's Archive. I am thrilled to welcome our guest tonight, Julie Klam. Of course, I have suddenly lost my notes. How did that happen? There we go. Always the way. I am delighted to be with you tonight for the second of our 3 book talks this month. Please, as always, introduce yourselves in the chat. Make sure that you're chatting to everyone instead of just panelists. Throughout the program, please put your questions for Julie in the chat so that we can bring them into our conversation. Before we begin, I want to say a few words about JWA for those who may be new to us. We are a digital archive that expands the Jewish narrative by documenting and sharing Jewish women's stories. We take an intersectional approach to Jewish history and culture because we believe that uncovering a more diverse story helps us understand the world we live in and create a better future. This series will give you a glimpse into some JWA resources, but I hope that you will check out jwa.org to explore the many other projects and resources that we offer. I'm now thrilled to introduce tonight's author. Julie Klam grew up in Bedford, New York. After attending NYU's Tisch School of the Arts and interning at Late Night with David Letterman, Julie went on to write for such publications as O, the Oprah magazine, Rolling Stone, Harper's Bazaar, Glamour, Real Simple, and for the VH1 television show Pop-Up Video, where she earned an Emmy nomination for outstanding special class writing. Her books, which are many, include Please Excuse My Daughter, You Had Me at Woof, Love at First Bark, Friend Keeping, The Stars in Our Eyes, and the book we're here to discuss tonight, The Almost Legendary Morris Sisters, which was a Washington Post Best Book of the Year. She has appeared on various shows, including The Tonight Show with Jimmy Fallon. Currently, she writes for the New York Times and the Washington Post. She lives in New York City with her family. Welcome, Julie. We are thrilled to have you here.
I'm thrilled to be here. I'm delighted. Thank you.
I would like to invite you, if you like, to read a few pages from your book for any members of our audience who may not have had the pleasure of reading The Almost Legendary Morris Sisters yet.
Sure. Okay, I'm going to read just a small part because I don't want people nodding off. The book is about my sort of like personal ancestry search for these relatives of mine that were very notorious in my family, but not necessarily with a true story. So anyway, this is starting on page 5. Every family has stories. Some people grow up hearing about their ancestors who were heroic or died violently. The accused Salem witch, the pioneer who lost a leg to frostbite but managed to walk 400 miles to settle his family and strike gold. Families who immigrated from Ireland or India, and the people who were not brought here by choice. All of these tales go into how we define ourselves. Are we from hardworking peasant stock or from enslavers? Do we live where our ancestors did, or are we scattered all over? How does knowing where we are from inform who we are? I heard a lot of stories growing up about my great-grandparents who came from exotic, distant lands, Russia, Moldova, Bessarabia, which sounded very Aladdin-like to me. But the only one that struck me as unusual and that I was interested in finding out about was the Morris sisters. They were, the family lore had it, 4 sisters who came to America sometime in the last century and were orphaned in the Midwest, but somehow managed to get to New York City and become millionaires without relying on any man, and lived in one house together. I thought of them as my great aunts, but actually they were my paternal grandmother's first cousins, so technically they are my first cousins twice removed. The story fascinated me. I had never heard anything like it before. It was as if the four sisters from Little Women had somehow been reimagined in the 20th century, and banding together had become wealthy through their own talents and ambitions. When I was a kid, I imagined they were rich Uncle Pennybags from Monopoly, or in this case, rich Aunt Pennybags, whose lives were luxurious, interesting, sparkly. It took me 40 years to realize that only one of those adjectives was true. It turned out there was as much, if not more, misinformation about the Moore sisters as there were facts. People who grow up in the 21st century with so much information immediately available to them might have difficulty imagining how it was possible for everyone, in this case, everyone in an extended family, to misremember, misunderstand, or misconstrue so many details about members of their own family. How could so many intelligent people throughout a family tree have so many verifiable facts so wrong? I actually understood it pretty well. Memory is funny. What we hear, what our brain chooses to highlight, is part of it. And if you hear something you aren't familiar with, your brain might turn it into something familiar. You can get a smattering of facts and piece them together, not even realizing you're filling in blanks with your own imagination. I would learn that finding the truth in a family can be tricky. For example, in 1999, when my grandfather died, my father had to get his birth certificate from the New York State Department of Health. And my father called the Office of Records in New York City and talked to a man who worked in this department. That's what you did at that time to get information. The man wrote down my grandfather's name and put the phone down. My father heard shuffling and file cabinet drawers opening in the background. 5 minutes later, the man returned to the phone to tell my father that he had a paper copy of my grandfather's birth certificate. All of my father's life, the one detail he knew for certain about his father was that his birthday was on Halloween, October 31st. To my brothers and me, this was significant because we were children and Halloween was among the most fun days of the year. Only it wasn't true. My grandfather's real birthday was November 9th, 9 days after Halloween. It's not as if my grandfather had a secret wife or hidden family, but learning this shocked my family. The truth can do that. Several years before that, I was a sophomore in college, and I remember sitting at my Aunt Maddie's dining room table in Manhattan, thumbing through an ASCAP magazine. That is the American Society of Composers, Authors, and Publishers. Music people get that. Something in the magazine must have jogged my memory as I mentioned to her that I was related to Irving Berlin. She came out of her kitchen and looked at me. "Who in your father's family is related to Irving Berlin?" she asked. There might have been a subtext of who in your father's loser family was related to one of the greatest composers of all time. She loves my father, but she was suspicious that his tone-deaf family could be related to the man responsible for White Christmas. "Not my father," I declared, "my mother." She blinked at me a few times. "If my sister is related to Irving Berlin, then I am related to Irving Berlin," Aunt Maddie said, "and I am not related to Irving Berlin." We immediately called my mother, and she and Maddie got into one of those conversations that sisters do, which run along the lines of, "Wasn't Aunt Ray's cousin's wife?" And lo, it turned out that my mother was wrong. I was no more related to Irving Berlin than I was to Julius Erving. My mother wasn't embarrassed or upset when she realized she was wrong. I guess I was thinking of someone else, she said. Perhaps we were related to a different Irving Berlin, or the Irving who owned a discount furniture store in Berlin, Iowa. "Well," my mother said, "we were related to Hart's Mountain." So now I'd go back to the 5 million people I told I was related to the greatest American songwriter and tell them that I'm not related to Irving Berlin, but actually to the flea prevention people. Or maybe I wouldn't, because I had always loved my quirky, cool pedigree. So what if it wasn't true? Who was going to find out? That conversation was way back in 1985, before the World Wide Web was born. So at the time, a lot of stories about family and ancestry were taken at face value. When somebody told me he was related to Elizabeth Cady Stanton, I couldn't ask for proof from ancestry.com. So I didn't ask for any documentation. I just believed them. And as a kid, if my parents said we were 1/8 into it, I would assume they were telling the truth, just as I assumed my relatives had written "God Bless America," because my mother had once mentioned it. I'm sure we all know people who have dazzling, or at least interesting, stories about their lineage. Your grandfather's cousin, who was the captain of the Mauritania, your mother's best friend, who was Theda Bara's makeup artist, Persian royalty, or Irving Berlin. It was always lovely to hear these stories, and the only necessary reaction is just to say, wow, why are these stories from our families so flawed? Many reasons. Oral history is not unlike a game of telephone. Even when people are trying to get the story right, it gets twisted in unexpected ways, and not necessarily in the ways we think. One detail you hear a lot when someone is investigating their family is that the family's name was changed when they immigrated at Ellis Island, for example, because the clerks didn't speak the language of the immigrant and wrote down whatever they felt the name was. My grandfather told me his grandfather had been Cooper Schmidt, but the Ellis Island officials, get a less polite term for them, changed it to Smith. But this is not actually true. When people came through Ellis Island during the 62 years that it was open as an immigrant station, the only information the immigration clerks had was the steamship's manifest with the names of the incoming immigrants. These had been filled in by the ship's officials in the originating country who spoke the language. The Ellis Island clerks, with the aid of an interpreter, asked each entrant questions to verify if they were the people on the manifest. It is true that some names were changed, but often it was done by the immigrants themselves before they left their country. Some of them may have wanted to sound more American when they got here, or they felt a certain spelling made it easier for people. Whatever the reason, a changed name wasn't because of a lazy admission clerk at Ellis Island. Yet you hear people repeating the story all the time. And that is the section. And I read that because that is something that I hear constantly. And it's wrong. And it was like a really interesting jumping off point for me, because you sort of can go, okay, everything that I know, I'm going to throw out until I start researching it.
I think that that's a story that so many of us grew up with, of various backgrounds, that they changed it at Ellis Island. And it is fascinating to realize that, in fact, that's almost never what happened.
Exactly. Henry Louis Gates tweets it occasionally. Your name was not changed at Ellis Island. I appreciate.
Well, that was a wonderful introduction to the slipperiness of family history. So I wonder if we could start by having you tell us a little bit. The title of your book is The Almost Legendary Morris Sisters. Who were the Morris sisters and what made them almost legendary?
So the story that I heard was that the Morris sisters' father, they were born in Romania, and their father wanted to be a movie director in Hollywood, and which is already kind of sketchy because it was around 1900 and Hollywood was very new. He wanted to be a movie director, and family came to New York, and they were driving to Los Angeles when the mother went into labor in St. Louis. She died in childbirth. They stayed there. The father put the children in an orphanage and they lived there. And then one of the sisters got a job in Cincinnati, which isn't even close to that, at JP Morgan, made a ton of money, was able to pay for the children to get out, and they came to New York, where she became really wealthy, and they all lived together and gave millions of dollars to Brandeis, and they ended up living in Southampton in a very, very expensive, fancy area. So that's what I heard. And there were, the true thing is they were 4 sisters, 3 came from Romania. They actually drove to, they actually were taking a train. They took a train to St. Louis, which is where they were intending to go, not Los Angeles. And the mother didn't give birth, the birth that she supposedly died in childbirth from, till 4 years later. And then she sort of disappears from, the records, and she didn't die. But they did become really wealthy and successful. One of them, Marcella, the second oldest sister, she was this incredible money person, and she was able to do this. The other ones kind of, did various other things. One of them was a playwright. She did a bunch of things for the WPA. But they were all a little bit, everybody in the family talked about them being a little bit crazy. And it's sort of like only when you start looking into it and you kind of zoom in that you realize that, they had things that would make anybody crazy happen to them. So that's who they were. I think there was another part of their story was that Marcella went to the White House to talk to FDR about pork bellies and winter corn, which was her specialty. And so all of these things were in sort of floating around me, and I wanted to find out like what the truth was. I wasn't looking to debunk it, but like from day one, things were not adding up to the story that I heard. And actually, to me, it was almost more interesting, because I was finding it. Oops, you're muted.
How many years have we been doing this? And I still sometimes need someone to say, you're on mute. One of the things that I loved in reading the book is that I went in expecting it to be something of a kind of conventional group biography.
Mm-hmm.
And that was not what I found. What I found was the story of your journey to discover who they were.
Mm-hmm.
What made you, is that the book you set out to write?
So it's kind of an interesting question. I don't really know. When I set out to write it, I thought I was writing their story, but I knew that I'm not a historian or an archivist or anything like that. I'm mostly a memoirist. So I knew whatever I was going to write had to sort of be filtered through my own thoughts, because I can't say things about, every historic part. I tried to, integrate everything that I could find, but mainly it had to be me doing this, because I otherwise it just wouldn't have made sense. So I thought I was telling one story, and I knew I was going to do some traveling. I had originally planned to write this book in 2010 after my first book, but it just wasn't the right time. I had done like a preliminary amount of research, and I had a little kid and a not very good marriage, and the idea of traveling and doing all of this just seemed impossible. So I ended up writing a different book, which was good. When I came back to this, Ancestry and the web were hugely different than they had been at that time. There was so much for me to find. The people that I had talked to when I started writing it in 2010 were no longer here. So I had all of this great stuff from them that I wouldn't have had if I had waited. So it was kind of like how it had to be done. And my kid is, 18, and so I could manage. So, almost no book that I start out writing is the one that I end up with. Usually halfway through it, I'm like, oh, I see what this is. If I'm lucky.
The book is taking you on its own journey in a way.
Yeah, kind of is. It's sort of like if you're depending on information that you haven't found yet, it's sort of it has to, and then you can react to it and genuinely react to it, which I think can be interesting.
One of the themes that I was intrigued by and that you kind of got at a minute ago is the theme of madness or craziness that sort of recurs in the family story in a variety of ways. I wonder if you could say a little bit about how madness was manifested both in their lives and in the way the family talked about their lives.
Well, so I think that what turned out that happened with the mother was that she didn't die in 1910. She was put into what they called the insane asylum in St. Louis, and she died there in 1953. So she was there from 1910 to 1953. And I was researching a lot of stories about women who were institutionalized then, and they were very much, a lot of people thought that they were like husbands who were tired of their wives who put them into a institution, which did happen, but that wasn't the case here. I mean, I went to the institution in St. Louis, which is not what it is anymore. It's now just like an empty building, but it was this really daunting, sort of intimidating looking building with this big dome. And they had a flood in the downstairs that destroyed all of the patients' records. So I got like one sentence about her, and it just said schizophrenia. And what schizophrenia was in 1910, I'm not sure. I know that in the early part of mental health history, pretty much the choices were a lobotomy or a lot of like fresh air was an option, and they did these like weird baths and stuff like that, but there really was nothing. And so she was the first, and actually her sister, who was my grandmother's mother, was also crazy. And people just don't say that anymore. We don't use those words, which is good because it's, not accurate. I mean, I think it could have been depression. It could have been postpartum depression. It could have been, a variety of things that may have been, very curable now. And I think that also they were not, the Moore sisters, they were like angry at a lot of people. They felt like other members of the family should have taken them out of the institution, out of the orphanage. I think that, so they weren't warm and friendly. And so they were like, oh, they're nuts. They hate men. They don't, it was all of these sorts of things that were very like generalized. I believe that there was mental illness in the family. I don't know from what in 2022 we would look at. I mean, they may be, if they were alive today and they had what they had, they might be on Prozac and fine. So but it was very interesting to me and disturbing, because I listed in the book reasons why women were institutionalized, and it was just anything. Reading a novel was one of the things on the list. So Yeah, I think, thank God things have gotten better in that way.
I was really interested in how the family members, you report your family members frequently describing the sisters
Mhm.
as crazy, and often not in the sense of, or at least I didn't get the impression that it was in the sense of the same way that their mother was
Mhm.
considered insane, but just like, we don't understand these people.
Right. Well, I think a big thing was the fact that only one of the four of them was married, and only for like 2 months. So the other ones had no interest in getting married or men or anything, and didn't do anything with men. And the other family members felt didn't like men. So right there, they're not interested in being married and having children. Like, what is that? Who would, what, that's insane. So I think that sort of informed their thought about them.
How did your perspective on the sisters change over the course of researching this book?
I think that I started with feeling like they were very off in the distance, like they were far away from me. And the more I researched them, the more I felt like they became mine. And I felt like I had so much empathy for the things that they went through, for the things that their father went through. They had a brother who had a very difficult time.
Mm.
Um, and I think that was like the overarching feeling, was that I felt sort of heartbroken for what they experienced, how they got here. Every bit of it was so difficult. And they, they didn't, that nobody gave them a break. Nobody in my family gave them a break. They all, everybody was willing to judge them harshly. So
Yeah, I mean, it seems like one of the themes running through it was that women who stepped outside in any way of very narrowly defined expectations for behavior were viewed with either pity or suspicion or hostility or some combination thereof.
right. Well, I wrote a little bit about the early women of Wall Street in the book, and how eventually they had to stop what they were doing, because everybody was kind of incensed that women were traitors. This was like the late 1800s, early 1900s. And so, part of the thing that I couldn't really find a lot on Marcella's business, because she kept it under the wire, under the, I mean, it couldn't be, you couldn't be out loud about your career. Or people would try to take it away from you. So I think that is absolutely true. And, it's just interesting, because I didn't, I would not have imagined when I was working on it, when I started working on it in, 2016, that we would be here, with, you know, losing Roe v. Wade, and, and things that are going on. It's like women, I mean, I'm on Twitter a lot, and I see people have been like defending their abortions, and now that there's this formula, that there's a big formula shortage in the country. People,
Yeah.
and then there's people who are saying, well, women shouldn't be using formula, they should be, and it's like, leave us alone. And everyone has to get out there and speak up about these things, and it's like, what? Well, that's not fair. Anyway, it's like everything, kind of everything old is new again, I guess.
It's unreal. I mean, it's horrifyingly real, but yes, it
Right.
is unreal. This movement that has been building for a long time, but feels like it's crescendoing at this
Yeah.
moment of
Right.
trying to force women back into a deeply essentialist maternal role.
Absolutely.
Um, Did you encounter, that actually makes me think, I hadn't thought about this until this moment in our conversation, but did you ever encounter anything about them that made you think that they had any sort of reaction to the feminist movements of the 60s and 70s? Because they would have been much older than many of the more visible participants.
I think their thinking was they were not surprised by it. They were not impressed by it. They did it when it was impossible.
Hmm.
I'm sure that they were pleased, but I mean, I think by that point they were. I mean, as they sort of their lives, as they got older and older, they got more inward and inward and inward, and I don't think they were paying that much attention at that point. But yeah, those are the people who made all of these things possible. They did it when they had no help. So yeah, I think it would have been interesting to hear.
Yeah. And for those who haven't read the book, without giving anything away, because there's some truly delightful surprises as you read through the book. Uh, Marcella was the trader, is that right? Yes.
Right.
Marcella, and she traded futures. Am I remembering that correctly?
Pork bellies and winter corn commodities.
Commodities. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. I'm about as familiar with these terms as you describe yourself as being in the book.
I was like, and I learned about it while I was writing the book, and then like the minute the book was done, it all left my head. So, but I remember that.
That must have been an extremely difficult world to be successful in as a woman.
Oh my God, you can imagine. The two there were two sisters who were close to Alexander Hamilton who started to work in those businesses, and in the book it said that people used to go down to Wall Street and like look in the window at the sisters, these two sisters who were traders. They would just like look in the window and like look at them trading, being women working, like, oh God, there they are. I mean, it's like that
spectacles.
it's not good.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. In a slightly different, going in a slightly different direction, did you get a sense as you were researching the book and you described going back to Romania, to where they were from, where their family immigrated from, did you get a sense of how their families and your family's Jewishness evolved over the course of the 20th century?
Yeah, something that I felt when I went to Romania, I felt, I have not ever been to Israel, but I have like nieces and cousins who did the birthright trip to Israel. And when I was in Romania, I kept thinking, this is the trip that people should go on. I mean, everybody should go to Israel, but this experience of going to the town where your family really lived and came from, and especially in Romania, I mean, there was at the turn of the century, there was something like 80,000 Jews there. And when I was visiting, there's something like 3,000. And that there are these like tiny little synagogues from the late 1800s that are pretty much left as they were because everybody went, and they're just sitting in the towns. My family was my parents' parents all were like kosher, and they weren't Orthodox, but they were more religious. And then my parents were Reform, and I feel like we are all very culturally Jewish in my group, not as religious, but definitely Jewish. And I didn't find I think partly like if you're a woman who's going to be on your own at that time, are and you're not getting married, and you're probably not really that welcome, you know, women couldn't sit with men in the synagogue anyway, you know, that it probably didn't seem like a great place for you. But you know, I think we're all very, very culturally Jewish.
And it seems like there was some, I mean, based on your description about the places they seem to have given money to, it seemed like they felt some connection to some sort of Jewish
Oh yeah,
community or affinity.
I mean, Brandeis was huge to them. None of them went there, obviously, and they were so proud that a Jewish man from St. Louis, you know, started that school, Abram Sakar, and they wanted to donate money, and they wanted to, you know, they loved the idea that it was the Jewish Harvard. So they definitely, you know, they were definitely Jewish and related to Judaism. But my uncle Herbie, who I interviewed a lot for the book, said that during Seder's, Marcella would keep running upstairs to the phone in the hallway. You know, they had this black dial phone, and calling in her broker things, you know,
Pork bellies.
or, yeah, buying pork bellies or whatever. Yeah. So I think there was, I think they were probably, you know, identified very strongly as Jewish, but didn't, you know.
Right. But that didn't necessarily mean religious observance.
Exactly. Yeah. And it just wasn't open for them.
Yeah.
As single women.
Indeed. And I would like to, I mean, I see people putting comments in the chat, and I'd like to remind everyone that you're welcome to put questions in. One more question that I had. Your first book, Please Excuse My Daughter, also explored how you were shaped by women in your family of origin. Do you see the Morris sisters book as being in conversation with that earlier work?
Absolutely. That was what I had intended to write that right after, because Please Excuse My Daughter was about me growing up with my mother. She had 3 sisters. They grew up in the Bronx. They were their mother and father wanted them to, you know, go where there were men and get married. And they were not invited to be in the family business. And, you know, and then, so for me, I grew up in that, and then sort of had to figure out where I was when, you know, I got out of college. There was not a rich man waiting to take care of me, nor did I want one. So, you know, there was a lot of sort of figuring out what would define me. And I think that with the Moore sisters, I felt like this was a really cool thing that I could be attached to, that there were these women that were not like my mother and her sisters, who were not, you know, sitting by the pool smoking and, you know, talking about whoever. And that was, you know, so that was sort of a neat thing for me to say, I'm related to them too, you know. So a lot of good it does, but.
Well, I mean, I think that it speaks to that the feeling that I think many people have, that there is something that we can learn about ourselves from who the people were that are in our family, whether we knew them or not.
Right, definitely. And I also think just, you know, your own response to what you learn about them informs you. I mean, I think that a lot of the stories that we're told are meant to put everybody in a good light. And then you hear these like heartbreaking, you know, other stories, and you don't go, oh, I don't want to be related to that. You're like, oh my God, this is me too. So, so I think like, I mean, I think exploring your family genealogy, I think it's fantastic. It's such a great thing to do. And, you know, a lot of us were home a lot in the last few years. And so I think it kind of blew up more, but it's really very profound, I think.
It also makes me think about the ways in which the stories that we're told that aren't necessarily positive can be used as a way of saying, as a way of putting boundaries up or barriers to say, well, these people were crazy.
Right.
People were
Right.
mean. These
Right.
aren't, this isn't the
Right.
model of womanhood that we want our children to follow in,
Exactly.
perhaps.
Exactly. I think that's exactly true. Yeah.
Yeah. Where does that leave those for whom knowledge of their biological family is inaccessible, do you think? Like,
I, in the same way that the stories that I heard were not true, I think that, like, the stories of anyone that who raised you or whatever, if it's, adoptive parents or, whoever you're finding out about, is really important and useful to you, because it kind of tells you where they were all coming from, what their orbit was. And that's useful in, forgiving people and forgiving yourself. I think, it's a very good thing.
I'm looking at questions from the chat. Toby asks, who put the grandmother, the mother of the four daughters, Clara, in the asylum?
So it must have been her husband. Her children were young. They weren't, this was, they had moved to St. Louis in 1904. She was put in 1910. I don't think that they had, like, acquired a huge group of friends, in that time. So it would have been him. When I was in St. Louis and I was working with a genealogist, we were trying to see if we felt like it could have been something, the genealogist, and then whatever she felt like, I felt like too. But she felt like it could have been something significant enough that it would have been in a newspaper of what happened. Like, it had to have been something, it had to be significant. It couldn't have just been a mild thing, because they had at that point 5 children, and they weren't able to he couldn't take care of them. Why would he have done that if it wasn't necessary? That's what we sort of decided, that it wasn't a matter of, like, he was tired of her, so he put her in a, and schizophrenia is pretty dramatic assessment, so diagnosis. So
Yeah. One person, Min, asks, could it have been voluntary rather than involuntary?
I would doubt it. It was a pretty horrifying place at that time. It was not like now, where you're, a celebrity says they're exhausted and they go, take time at a place. It was really grim and frightening. Everything that I read about it at the time, it would have been probably terrifying to be committed to a place like that. So I would doubt that she was even aware of what was happening.
That seems likely to me, based on my limited knowledge of asylums at the time. Cindy Rizzo asks a question that I also was wondering about. She notes that one of the tags for the book is LGBT. Is there any evidence for or reason to think that
where is that tag on Amazon?
Yeah, that's what Cindy is saying. Yes, that one of the tags.
I don't know where those come from. They definitely don't come from me, but I mean, I have no, when they certainly didn't, there was nothing I found that said that they were gay. They may have been, and great if they were. I don't know why that would be on there, except that I think that Amazon like picks up everything from every person, I wouldn't be surprised if it said like horse racing also, because they just, it's not a science. But yeah, I mean, they claim to hate men, so maybe who knows.
One of the things I was delighted by in the book, among many, was the afterword. I wonder if you can tell us about how you learned about the details of the husband of one of the sisters, the very brief time he was her husband. And if you've encountered any more, if anyone else has come up with surprises that you hadn't discovered since the publication of the book.
I haven't, I've met a few people who had met them through their lives and things like that, but nothing really big. But the book was like copy edited and going into production. And I have a very good friend who's an author, Anne Leary, who was obsessed with ancestry, and anything she does 100,000,000%, so she knew how to do everything. And I was talking to her on the phone, and she was saying like, how do you feel about everything? And I said, I feel really good. I really wish I could have figured out who Ruth was married to, but I couldn't. And she said, Paul Kodacek. And I was like, what? What? She actually, like, in her magical way, went and found that. And then while we were on the phone looking at this, Anne Googled his name and found that his mother, there had been this big Times article written about his mother, who had an Egon Schiele painting that the Nazis took, and she got back. It was this fascinating story. And then I contacted his granddaughter, who had no idea. She said that vaguely they knew that he had been married before, but there was no real information about it. But it was fun to sort of talk to her, because I didn't have like firsthand knowledge of Ruth, but she had firsthand knowledge of her grandfather, and I knew that Ruth was into free love, and her grandfather had been at that time, and they lived in Greenwich Village, and it was very bohemian, and so that we figured they probably met at a cafe and had free love.
Oh, that sounds so exciting. What a discovery. Although also frustrating when the book is almost going into production.
Well, it was like, I called my editor and I was like, something terrible has happened. And he said, what? And I said, I have information I've got to get in the book. And he said, I'll call you right back. And he called me and he said, we can do it.
In other words, it was literally a stop the presses moment.
Stop the presses. We've got to get this in there. And even Sarah, his granddaughter, was able to get me a photo of him. I mean, it was really, really cool to get that, because there were some things that I will never know, because they're not really true. Like the visit to the White House, may not have actually happened, but but it was very fun and exciting. It was horrifying at first. I was like, with everything that when something unexpected happens and I'm supposed to be done with it, I'm just like, I want to be dead. And so his reaction was better. Calm down, we can do this, we can get it in there, it's okay. And we did, and that was very satisfying.
That's wonderful. We have a question in the chat of someone else in the audience who knows of someone whose paternal grandmother died in an insane asylum, and she's interested to know if there's more. And that is another question I had too, which is, do you have any advice for people who would embark on researching their family history, whether specifically someone who is in a hospital or more broadly?
So unfortunately, if you are Jewish, things are a lot harder. The Jewish Family Services doesn't want to give information to anybody except the person. So that's kind of impossible. So, all of the stuff with the orphanages and everything, it's a matter of contacting people. And I have to say that the librarians, the archivists, the genealogists I worked with were incredibly generous, thoughtful, helpful, wanted to find the answers as much as I did, and went that extra mile. So definitely, get help. There's so many people who are interested in it and love to do it and know better, because it really is in the beginning like needle in a haystack. And so that, I think that is, you've got to get help. It's just, even going on Ancestry and knowing what to look for is, what I went to this, to the New York Historical Society, and this woman from the Genealogical Society in New York was there, and she was saying the hits that you get when you put something into Ancestry are their choices. It's not necessarily the most relevant to yours. So you really have to go through them. And I didn't know that at that point. So these people are great.
I was so struck in the book. One of the things that I really appreciated is how much time you gave to the people who worked with you on the book. And I wonder if you could say more about your choice to include them so explicitly and portray them the way you did.
Well, I think that like they're sort of unsung heroes, and I wanted to sing them. They're people who are, archivists, whatever their sort of background is, and they're working in these, these Jewish museums or these Jewish history resources, and they do these incredible things. I mean, it's like magic to me that they can find information on your relatives 100 years ago or more, and it's on like onion skin paper, and and they're not, you're not paying them to do it. That's what they do, and they deserve to be heralded.
Well, I also loved it because, I mean, first of all, because as someone whose background is as a historian, I have a deep appreciation for and gratitude toward archivists and librarians and all the people who make research possible. I also liked it because I felt like it sort of, in a sneaky way, disrupted the idea of the author as like the sole figure in the creation of this kind of book.
Oh,
and
yeah.
it really open, like it's clearly your voice. It's clearly you are the driving force behind it. You are the one who actually goes and does it. It doesn't, this isn't
Right, but if it wasn't
away from your authorship.
Right about. So you're absolutely right. I mean, I think that like if you're wanting to research your own family, kind of seeing somebody go through it and saying, oh, Julie Klam met this genealogist in St. Louis who was really helpful and took her all over the city and did all of these things. Like, people do that. These are all volunteers. All the people that I worked with were volunteers there, and that doesn't affect their. There wouldn't have been anything if I didn't have that help. So,
and I liked that we got to hear their voices. Like, we got to just get little glimpses of them as people as well. And so I really enjoyed the way you wove them into the narrative like that.
Thank you.
Well, it has been such a pleasure speaking with you tonight. Thank you so much for being with us.
Pleasure being here.
For anyone who hasn't yet had the pleasure, I highly recommend reading the almost legendary Morris sisters. And I also just want to mention that next week we have our last QBT conversation of May with Cindy Rizzo, who joins us tonight. I'm so delighted to see your name.
I'll find the questions that week.
She is the author of the thriller, The Paper Cutter, and she will be speaking with guest moderator Edie Klein. I also wanted to mention that registration is now open for our June online history course, which will look at the history of Jewish women in film and television. And it will be hosted by our fearless leader, Judith Rosenbaum, who will have returned from her sabbatical at that point. I hope you can join us for these events. It was a pleasure having all of you here. Thank you to the audience for being with us tonight. Thank you again to Julie, and I hope you all have a wonderful evening.
Thank you.